these people?
Who are these people? Hi, everybody. It's Indy, and I am back for another one-on-one with somebody I have been really excited to talk to for years, literally years. And I know you're going to be excited to talk to him to hear this conversation. We have been talking for a little bit, but I've been reading his articles literally for years on our show. He is an Indie Media Award honoree, so I'm super excited about that. He writes for Mid-Press News. He has also written for Fair and other publications. And let me welcome our guest, Alan McLeod. How are you?
Good to be with you. Very good, thanks.
So again, it's a pleasure. Again, I'm just kind of a little tongue tied, but I always usually start out by asking people kind of how did we end up having this conversation? I think in this case it's a little bit different because you don't really know me that well. So I kind of would like a little bit more about how did you get into reporting independently?
Yeah, sure. Listen, I was quite a precocious kid, and I never really got baptized into propaganda with the corporate media. I always thought something was up, but it was a long, long time before I actually figured out what was up. There was something in the back of my head, and what it was basically being exposed to radical thinkers, people like, for example, the work of Noam Chomsky, and from there, reading his work and thinking, oh, this is something that I never hear on the television, and then looking at who he's citing, and that just opens up a massive world of sources, mostly in books, unfortunately. And back in the day, you could also find these people on the internet pretty easily. However, it's much harder to do nowadays. Yeah, so I went and did a PhD about media literacy, media bias, and propaganda. And from there, I produced two books and started to work at fairness and accuracy in reporting. And from there, it kind of snowballed into working in alternative journalism, which was not something that I was really expecting to do or focusing on, but it happened nonetheless. I'm very happy and feel very fortunate that it did.
Yeah, that's terrific. A PhD in media studies. That was in Scotland, right?
Correct. At the Glasgow University Media Group. It was specifically about media coverage of Venezuela, which, has been very, very timely for the last 25 years, but perhaps no more timely than when we're speaking now.
Yes, and actually, so I was actually going to point out, and I remember that you were an observer in 2024 of the Maduro election, that is, quote unquote, contested by at least Edison Research, nobody else really, but I wanted to hear you talk about kind of what you saw there and what you think about what's happening to and in Venezuela right now. I think that again, I also see that was a pretty relevant topic to go into, and it's coming to a head right now, right?
Sure. So I've been monitoring closely the Venezuelan elections for a good decade or so. So it was very nice to actually be out in Venezuela in July 2024 to actually see it firsthand. Been in Venezuela loads of times. I think I went, I don't know, 4 or 5 times in 2024 alone. And one of them was to be an official election observer for the presidential election, which pitted Nicolas Maduro up against, I think, 12 opposition candidates. So there were 13 people on the ballot. Now,
Hmm.
if you read the corporate media in the US, you hear that this election was, ridiculously one-sided, um, a farce, a sham, what have you. Maduro stole the election, etc. But we have to remember, we have to have long memories and realize that the United States media have said this about pretty much every election in Venezuelan history that the socialists have won ever since 1998. So the fact that they're saying that should really carry very little weight. And what I saw as one of nearly 1,000 official election observers from almost 100 countries around the world was an election that actually was very open, very transparent in ways that we in the West really can barely fathom. I mean, even to start off with, having 13 people running for president, having that sort of choice on the ballot is something that people in, for example, the United States really have no experience with. In order to vote in Venezuela, you need your national ID card, and you go to the polling center which you've registered with in your local area. You're then manually checked off against a list of people there. Your ID card is, matched against your face. So that's the first line of defense against fraud. Secondly, you vote on an electronic voting machine, and then a paper ballot is produced from that electronic voting machine. You have to search, you have to check the paper ballot yourself, make sure it matches perfectly with your vote, and then you can put the paper ballot in a cardboard voting box. You also have to give your fingerprint on the voting machine to make sure that you can vote on the voting machine to begin with. So that's another layer of protection against fraud. So your face has to match, your finger has to match. You also, once you have voted and you've checked off your vote, you have to go back and sign your name against the list, and then you also have to give your thumbprint against your signature. The paper ballots are each checked in each election facility. All the paper ballots are counted. A random audit of about 53% of paper ballots is checked. If there's a discrepancy of even one vote between the paper ballot count and the electronic ballot account, a huge alarm is raised, and then that just shuts down the system nationwide. All of this paper ballot counting, by the way, is done openly, and representatives of all parties and indeed other interested groups can watch the paper ballot count in action. This is all presided over by the National Electoral Council, which has been going for more than 20 years. This election process has really been a model for countries all around the world to follow. In 2013, President Jimmy Carter said, through gritted teeth, I would frankly say, because his election monitoring organization, the Carter Center, is no friend of the Venezuelan government. In fact, it's staffed by academics who've wanted to see the back of Chavez and Maduro for as long as they've been in power. He said that the election system in Venezuela is the best in the world. And frankly, I think I would have to agree with him. What I saw on the ground there was an open election where people were not scared to come up and talk to you. The minute that they saw that you had a badge on you that said International Observer, people would come up and talk to and usually in English, and they would literally chew your ear off about how. Usually, it was because how they hated Maduro, how the country was going to pot, how they couldn't wait to, leave the country, etc., etc. And that's because most people who speak English in Venezuela come from the rich, educated elite. Venezuela is a country where very few people actually speak English. The English proficiency in the country is lower than that of countries like, say, Yemen and Oman, just to give you an example of how few people actually speak the language there. I went to 5 election stations in the Caracas area on that day, most of them in opposition areas. And the words that the election officials generally used to describe the process, there were 2 that came up constantly. One was tranquilo, which means tranquil or calm, and the other one was smooth, suave, or calma as well, meaning calm. And
Mhm.
that was basically what I saw. There were a lot of long lines, especially in the morning, and that was especially in the pro-government areas, actually. Not so much in the opposition areas, but more in the pro-government areas. Some people were forced to wait for, 60 minutes, 90 minutes even to vote, which, is not great. I also spoke with the people who are actually in charge of the election stations. One of them was a young woman, was openly telling me, a foreign journalist telling me that she is a member of the opposition party, that she hates Maduro, that she is only saving money so she can leave the country and go to Spain, that she wants Maria Corina Machado to go through. And yet, even when I was saying that, I said, well, what is your confidence in the election? She said, no, I have complete confidence in the electoral process itself. I just hate Maduro. And that is really what most Venezuelans seem to think about the process. And that's what I saw. I saw an election that was very open, marred, of course, with violence from the opposition that happened after they lost when Edmundo Gonzalez, the far right candidate, the only opposition figure who refused to endorse, opposition presidential candidate who refused to endorse the election, because of course 11 out of the 12 opposition candidates did endorse the results. He
Mhm.
refused to do so. His voice was amplified across the world in corporate media everywhere. And the narrative in the West became that this was a stolen election. But in fact, I actually witnessed firsthand, it was in the election center where the woman who said that she was an opposition member was, right in the center of Caracas. I actually watched as at 5 minutes to 6 p.m., when the centers are supposed to close, a huge crowd of opposition activists uh, descended upon the place and started blocking people from coming in and started filming themselves. Uh, the place was, they immediately started chanting, shut this down. And the electoral services refused to close down the election center. What was going on there? I wasn't sure at the time. But what happened an hour and a half later, when they did shut the election center down finally, was that these people staged a stunt where they said, "Let us in, let us in. You're blocking us from voting." They weren't being blocked from voting at all, but that footage, some of which I'm actually in, you can see in the back of my head and my arm in some of the shots, is an astroturfed opposition crowd saying that they're being refused entry into the electoral centres to vote, which couldn't have been further from the truth, because it was an hour and a half afterwards. They'd been there for, yeah, as I said, 90 minutes or more. And some of them were even talking very loudly in front of foreign journalists, I'll add, saying that we shouldn't let anyone in unless they're from our side, meaning that they were trying to block pro-government people from voting in the election. So there were problems with the election, but most of them um, really was sourced to the fact that the US government had sanctioned the country, was putting Venezuela under enormous economic strain, and that there were these pro US NED backed opposition groups who were trying to cause chaos in the election, and then later did actually go out and destroy buildings. Um, Later on, a couple of days later, they even, I was staying in the same hotel as a load of diplomats who were in Caracas, who had their bus hijacked by armed opposition activists, and the bus was forced to turn around and go back to the hotel. That never made international media. That never made headlines. That dozens of diplomats couldn't get on their flight because the peace-loving Maria Corina Machado inspired opposition, Nobel Peace Prize winning types were actually attempting to kidnap foreign dignitaries. But this is par for the course in Venezuela. It's really ground zero for fake news and misreporting, which is why I wrote an entire book on it. Some might say that Palestine has surpassed that by now, but Venezuela is still right up there at the top.
That's why that almost reminds me, when you say that, of the Brooks Brothers Brigade from the 2000 election, when in the United States, when what's his name, the guy that has the Nixon tattoo on his back, Roger Stone, led an entire group of people to charge the office where they were counting the ballots down in South Florida. They're all wearing Brooks Brothers khakis and clothes, and they called it the Brooks Brothers, pounding on the door, let us in, stop the count. Very similar to like what you're talking about right here, where they're saying stop the voting. Kind of similar model. But wow. So now that we've seen what's happened in the last 18 months since Maduro was actually legally elected, took office, Trump comes in, starts blustering about fake election, talking about Machado. She gets the Nobel Peace Prize, and we all believe that was, kind of setting up that they wanted her to potentially take over the country as a president, or at least to put a model in place with people friendly to her. What do you think happened there, and how do you see this playing out?
Oh yeah, well, on Machado, she has been groomed for this role for more than 2 decades. I mean, it was 2005 that George Bush invited her for a formal meeting in the Oval Office, which is something that usually only foreign heads of state receive. Her election organization and political group, Sumate, has been in receipt of NED funds for more than 2 decades. The NED, as probably most people who are watching this know, is a front group for the CIA. It was established by the Reagan administration as a semi-privatized way of funding some of the CIA's most controversial foreign plots and machinations, because simply there had been too much media attention focused on the CIA. So they wanted to outsource it, basically.
Yeah, I actually
Machado has
read
always
your
represented the
NED article on Tuesday night's live show, actually, the one you did recently. It literally goes through the entire cataloged history of incident by incident by incident of times when the NED funded candidates had destabilized the country. Great article, by the way. So if you guys hadn't seen that, go check that out at MintPress. But yeah, sorry.
Yeah, thanks. Yeah, on Machado, yeah, I guess she's represented the far right, the really truly far right of Venezuelan politics for many decades. She was a key member in the 2002 coup against Hugo Chavez, where US aligned forces and the US, indeed, the US government itself participated in the kidnapping of Hugo Chavez. That was only overthrown 48 hours later after a massive uprising inspired loyal troops to take back the presidential palace. So yeah, Machado has always represented this far right strain in Venezuelan politics. In the 2010s, she was the figurehead of the Guarimbas, the campaigns, these street barricades which went up all across Caracas and other cities, which far right protesters set things on fire, put razor wire across roads to garrote and behead passers-by, shooting at police and National Guard, even carrying out huge terror bombing campaigns against things like kindergartens, schools, universities, the Caracas subway. There's even video footage of them hunting down Afro-Venezuelans, black people, assuming them to be correctly, in most cases, Chavista, meaning supporting of the government, and then dousing them in petrol, stabbing them, and burning them to a crisp. That's the sort of tactic they're undertaking. And I have in print said that this reminds me of a sort of secular ISIS. And I think that is a completely fair comparison to draw. So that is who Machado is. She recently won the Nobel Peace Prize and then dedicated it to Donald Trump immediately. I was not surprised by any of this because I know the history of the Nobel Peace Prize, the sort of people who've won it over the years, these, monsters like the Israeli presidents or Henry Kissinger, people like that. So, the Nobel Peace Prize has always been, a joke and something of a farce. So I wasn't surprised about that at all. What was your other question? Sorry. Oh yeah, what about Maduro? Yeah, I guess this latest happening where the US literally went into Venezuela with their special forces, kidnapped a sitting president and abducted him and took him away to the United States is incredibly shocking. But in some cases, in some ways, it really shouldn't be considered that surprising because the United States has done this. It's got a long history of doing this to foreign leaders. It did it, for example, to Maduro's predecessor, Hugo Chavez, who I just spoke about a couple of minutes ago. It also did it to General Noriega, the president of Panama, who it abducted on drugs charges, which were probably true. But the key thing that's left out of that story is that those drugs charges were while he was on the payroll of the CIA. So he'd become something of a disobedient thug, a disobedient dictator. So they decided to take him out. The US was also involved in the kidnapping of Jean-Bertrand Aristide, the president of Haiti. Aristide was this populist priest who'd been democratically elected on a promise of populism, of trying to bring Haiti's natural resources back under Haitian control and for a better future for the Haitian people, and not just to, allow all of their wealth to be siphoned off into the United States. Aristide was, as I said, kidnapped by pro-US forces and forced to spend pretty much the rest of his life in exile in Africa. So, yeah, the United States has got a long and storied history of kidnapping foreign leaders. So what will happen to Maduro remains to be seen, but certainly inside Venezuela, there are gigantic protests against this. It's really rallied so many of the people around the government, and even pretty much all of the opposition have come out and denounced this as not the way to go forward. And the small amounts of oppositionistas who are saying, yes, we want the United States to bomb our country, people like Maria Corina Machado, have seen their public opinion ratings crater to single figures. So even if Machado is somehow ensconced into the Miraflores presidential palace in Caracas, I can't imagine that she's going to be able to hold power for very long because she will face constant protests nationwide and probably all sorts of insurrections from the millions of people in Venezuela who are armed and are part of pro-government, socialist, or radical militias.
It's going to be interesting to see how it plays out there for sure. And then, as far as, are we going to have U.S. troops on the ground protecting the oil like we did for Syria? Because we know that that was really Trump's biggest motivation. There's also the connection between Machado and Israel. I think you've written about that in the past, and there's been a lot of conversations where she was accepted like as some kind of a member, a partner of the Likud party, and that they have a partnership versus Maduro, who is acknowledging Palestinians and calling for Gaza to be run by Palestinians. How much of that has
Oh,
a
yeah.
factor, do you think, in Trump's move, in the timing of all of this, in the Isaac Accords that they're now trying to put into place for South America? Does that all tie in?
Yeah, I guess so. I mean, I think if the United States boots were on the ground, as I said, there are millions of Venezuelans who are part of militias who, just before he was abducted, Maduro decided to arm the people of Venezuela, which is not really something that a traditional dictator tends to do when he's threatened. But, that is what happened. So I think if the United States tried to go in and forcefully control oil fields, it would result in another Vietnam where snipers would be raining down on them constantly. It might be the case that they can come to some sort of agreement with the Venezuelan government, which is funny because they certainly didn't need to get rid of Maduro if they wanted some sort of agreement, because Maduro and Chavez before them, all they've ever wanted to do is sell the oil of Venezuela to the United States and other countries at a reasonable price. But it was precisely this that the Bush administration and later Obama and even more this first Trump administration blocked them from doing so by placing sanctions upon the country. They wanted to crush Venezuela. They didn't want to be purchasing Venezuelan oil. Um, as far as Israel comes into it, yeah, Marina Corina Machado has significant ties to Israel. In 2019, her party, Venti Venezuela, uh, signed a deal with the Likud party of Benjamin Netanyahu, which placed them into a formal partnership, for want of a better word. She also wrote a letter, a public one, to Benjamin Netanyahu, imploring him to be part of an international, well, she called it a humanitarian mission, but basically an invasion of Venezuela to remove Maduro and put her in power. Um, she was actually blocked from running in the 2024 elections because she was jumping around all over the world to, the OAS in Panama calling for an invasion of Venezuela, which broke the electoral rules, which is why she was blocked from running in the first place. Um, Maduro and the socialists, by contrast, have been keen supporters of Palestinian liberation. I mean, I also went to Venezuela in 2024 and participated in the International Conference Against Fascism, Zionism, and Other Related Ideologies, which made clear constantly, Maduro himself was there talking about how Zionism is a form of fascism. And at that conference, I also spoke to, actually, it wasn't at that conference, it was another time that I was in Venezuela, but I spoke to the Palestinian ambassador to Venezuela, and he said in no uncertain terms that Venezuela was the leader worldwide in Palestinian solidarity. And you can really see that if you travel across the country. Everywhere, especially in poorer areas, you will see murals of Palestinian fighters, of poets, of the flag, of people wearing keffiyehs. You'll see that all the time on the subway or wherever. People are really showing their support for Palestine in a way that you don't see in the West so much. You might see a Palestinian flag here and there, but not like in Venezuela. And it's so important to the Venezuelans that as Maduro was casting his ballot in the 2024 election, he shouted, "Long live free Palestine." That was what he wanted the world to hear when he was putting his his ballot in the box. That was the soundbite that he wanted everyone to hear played all around the world. So yeah, I think Palestine is a really important issue because everyone, every oppressed group in the world sees themselves and their fate in the Palestinians. And every oppressor sees a little bit of themselves in the Israelis. And that's why it's become such a key issue for people all around the world.
Yeah. Yeah. I also wanted to ask, you talk about how people in the West haven't really heard these stories, and that partly is because of the next thing I want to talk about, which is your investigations into social media and tech infiltration by Israeli operatives in Unit 8200 and the IDF, but also CIA, Defense Intelligence Agency people, really all over the intelligence spectrum, where they have gotten high ranking executive level positions to put them in positions of power where they can affect change and affect policy making and decision making at these organizations that then decide what's censored, what's amplified, and what's suppressed. Correct? Talk a little bit about that and the companies that you found, and how how you kind of pulled on that thread a little bit.
Yeah, this all started on January 6th. I know exactly the date. It was January 6th, the day of Donald Trump's insurrection um, against at the White House and the Capitol. When Trump launched this, basically the only sort of consequence he received was having his social media platforms deleted, and they were deleted pretty much en masse, like Facebook, uh, Instagram, et cetera, Twitter, all took that decision on the same day. And I was just interested to know, well, how did that come about? Who's actually making those decisions? Because if you go to these social media platforms, websites, you don't get any information about who's actually calling the shots and pulling the strings. So in the end, I went to employment databases like LinkedIn and ZoomInfo and stuff, and just started writing in, Facebook, etc., and just seeing who came up. And what I found was really startling to me, and it built upon the work of other people who had started talking about this in the 2010s. What I found basically was that without exception, every single big social media company that you have heard of, including Facebook, Instagram, Meta, Google, Microsoft, TikTok, all of them have started employing hundreds of agents of the US national security state. Probably the best example of this is Aaron Berman. Aaron is the head of Facebook's social media content policy. He is the face of Facebook content moderation. He's the one that's ultimately deciding what billions of people who use Facebook, more than 3 billion use it every month. He's deciding what they see and what they don't see in their news feeds, what accounts are suppressed and what accounts are promoted, what ideas go viral and what are stamped out. And what I found very quickly at looking at Aaron's history is that Aaron is a CIA agent, or at least he was until one day in the summer of 2019, where he left his job at the CIA and immediately was parachuted into becoming a misinformation policy manager at Meta, which is Facebook and Instagram and WhatsApp's parent company. This was astonishing to me because Aaron Berman, before this, was one of the highest ranking members of the CIA. He, for example, wrote the president's daily briefs for both President Obama and President Trump. These were security briefs that were read out in the White House. So he wasn't even just some pen pusher at the CIA. He was one of the top people at the agency in Langley. And just by typing things like CIA Facebook or NATO TikTok into LinkedIn, I was able to find hundreds and hundreds of examples of national security state agents who left their job in the national security system and were given top roles, extremely influential roles in social media companies. These roles were not in politically neutral fields like advertising or marketing or customer services. They were always in security and misinformation and content moderation. And what we've seen really paints into a wider picture that since 2016, we've seen a real crackdown on the ability to practice speech and anti government speech online. what we've seen is since 2016, we've seen big social media companies under pressure from the US government change their algorithms to promote what they call authoritative sources and demote what they call borderline content. And what they mean by authoritative sources is corporate media who we all grew up on, like CNN, the New York Times, Fox News, CBS, etc. And what they mean by borderline content is that basically any company that's not a gigantic multinational media corporation, and especially those that come after the powerful and critique the US government, militarism, war, the corporate state, etc. And so when Google launched Project Owl and changed its algorithm, overnight, we in alternative media saw our viewing and our statistics just fall off the cliff. We were really decimated. You know, big companies like The Intercept and Democracy Now! Lost 20, 30, 40% of their viewership. And it was even worse at more radical outlets like Mint Press. We, for example, lost more than 90% of our Google traffic overnight, and it's never come back. And we lost over 99% of our Facebook traffic overnight, never to come back. So what this really represents, when you have people at the very highest levels of Facebook, of Reddit, of Instagram, of Twitter, etc., controlling these policies, this amounts to state censorship, but on a global level, because it's not just Americans that are feeling this censorship. All of these platforms I'm talking about are all headquartered in America, but they are global platforms. So whether you're in Bahrain, Burundi, Botswana, or Britain, your feeds are being controlled by these people who used to be in the FBI, in the NSA, and the CIA. This is a gigantic problem which very few people are grappling with. And we can understand this. I mean, imagine if we were on, let's just change some of the um, the names of this. Imagine we were on a Russian social media company that was filled with FSB and KGB agents. We would immediately see that the idea that this is some sort of free and open platform is laughable. But in fact, nobody's really talking about this, how the ability to access a wide range of information on the internet is being slowly constricted and destroyed for the generation of the 2020s. The internet in the 2000s was very, very open, and you could find whatever you wanted on there. But the problem was that not many people were there. But throughout the 2010s, with the adoption of laptops in the home, and especially of phones, smartphones, people are online constantly. And so that suddenly becomes a huge battleground, which any powerful entity, especially the most powerful in the world, like the US government, wants to control. And they, since 2016, have really throttled the market to the point where I really don't see how we can differentiate the difference between the national security state and our big social media companies. I don't see where one ends and the other begins, and that is very worrying.
Oh,
Now,
and
just to your point about, I don't know if you want to jump in, but feel free
yeah,
to do.
yeah.
But I was going to talk about.
I had two quick points, but one was that in response to your work, what the social media companies and what these people have done is hide their visibility from LinkedIn. That wasn't really solving the problem. And then I lost my train of thought on the other one, but it's just amazing that the other one was Snowden. Snowden was a canary in the coal mine when it came to that. As somebody who was loaned out from NSA over to I can't remember the org now, three names, but it's a big consulting firm, and he was effectively a plant, somebody who was there to do the job that they needed. But if his agency needed information or needed him to do something while he was there, he was in a position to be able to do that for them. Correct?
So I think that's my understanding. Yeah.
Yeah. So,
What I was going to
more
say
on
about.
social media
Oh
stuff.
yeah,
So,
sorry. You go.
go ahead. Go ahead. Yeah, no, let me let you continue.
Well, you specifically asked me about Israeli penetration of this. It's not, and I didn't answer that. It's specific. It's not just the United States where this is happening. It's not just the U.S. government that's trying to penetrate social media companies and bend them to their will is also the Israeli government, and in particular, a unit, spying unit of the Israeli military called Unit 8200, which is the most elite spying organization within the Israeli military. It was behind, for example, the Lebanon pager attack that we saw a couple of years ago, where thousands of Lebanese civilians were injured. It was behind so many of the most intrusive and explosive spyware scandals that have happened, including the Pegasus scandal. It also designed the AI driven kill lists, which were used to find targets in Gaza and wipe out more than 30,000 targets in just a few weeks. Unit 8200 is really the centerpiece of the Israeli surveillance system. And we've also seen it infiltrate the highest levels of social media and indeed corporate media as well. One example of this is TikTok and Rayot Medallion. She enjoyed a very long career at Unit 8200, serving as an intelligence commander for the unit, and later even becoming head of cybersecurity operations for Unit 8200. Now, in the wake of Israel's attack on Gaza, she moved to New York City in December of 2023, and she took a job as the global incident manager for TikTok's trust and safety division, essentially, deciding what content would be seen and what wouldn't be seen again. Considering what was going on at the time in the world, I think it's fair to wonder what sort of global incidents she was working on for TikTok and why she was hired in the first place. That is extremely worrying to see. But as I said, there's an article I wrote called something like, I think I've got it up on screen somewhere, revealed the former Israeli spies working in top jobs at Google, Facebook, and Microsoft, where you can find all sorts of information on this. But they've also penetrated standard, what do you call it, corporate media. One example of this is Axios, where one of its head writers. Let me just get the article up so I can have a look at it perfectly.
Sure. So yeah, Axios,
Sorry.
yeah, corporate media, and of course Barry Weiss now with CBS News, Paramount, Skydance being placed there, but she wasn't 8200, of course. I lose you. Okay, you're looking it up.
Sorry,
Um,
sorry for that. Yeah, one of these, one of the examples of this is Axios, and its reporter Barak Ravid, who is the main Pentagon politics reporter for that news organization. Ravid actually won the like a famous journalism prize recently, where it was basically like the Oscars for politics journalism, and he was presented the award by Joe Biden himself. Now, Ravid has basically made a career for himself laundering US national security and Israeli national security talking points into the mainstream press. But what he and a lot of other people don't talk about a lot is how he is literally an Israeli spy, or at least he was until at very least 2023, when he says he quit his job in Unit 8200 as a reservist to go full time as a journalist. And Ravid is not alone. I mean, CNN, for example, has hired a whole bunch of former Israeli spies, former agents from Unit 8200, one of which is Sachar Paled, who spent 3 years as an officer in Unit 8200. She was a team leader there. She led in the area of surveillance, intelligence, and cyber warfare. And she also was a technology analyst for Shin Bet, which is another Israeli intelligence service. And in 2017, she was suddenly hired as a producer and writer for CNN, and she spent years working on some of the most influential politics shows on that network, like, for example, Christiane Amanpour and Fareed Zakaria's programs. You could also have a look at, for example, Tal Heinrich, who again spent 3 years as a Unit 8200 agent and then became a desk producer for CNN. at the Israel Bureau. After she left CNN, she actually became the official spokesperson for Prime Minister Benjamin Netanyahu. So there's this revolving door between the Israeli intelligence services, corporate media in the United States, and the Israeli government, which very few people are aware of, but perhaps it might seem kind of obvious to them when they look at the sort of ludicrously biased coverage that's come out of CNN, the New York Times, and all of these groups that have hired these former Israeli spies to actually write their news about Israel and Palestine. Of course, they knew what they were getting into. I was able to find these people's backgrounds um, pretty easily. So the idea that they wouldn't be able to find these things when they're giant corporate entities that can, do their homework on who they're hiring is ludicrous. They knew exactly who they were getting, and they were not only comfortable with it, but it seems that being an Israeli spy was actually a check in the box for you if you want to get ahead in media. And that is very worrying indeed.
Absolutely. Uh, yeah. So you also did an article about Apple and Unit 8200 spies being infiltrated at the hardware company. So again, it's not just social media, but they're trying all methods of technology. Yeah, again, I remember distinctly reading about TikTok as a Trojan horse. I remember reading about the Unit 8200 spies within the Apple divisions and how they, like you said, literally walk right out of Unit 8200 and seem to be hired as if Apple and these companies are targeting and looking for Israeli intelligence people to say, well, if they worked on that technology, maybe they'll do well for our company, or they'll bring XYZ into our company. Yes, it's really frightening because of the propaganda that goes with that, of the messaging that goes along with, well, this is also the unit that is blowing up houses in Gaza, for example. So you're really looking to hire the people that are building the bombs that do that and building the technology, the Lavender AI that you talked about, and the Where's Daddy program specifically that targeted journalists and their families in their homes and had them murdered for reporting on the truth of what Israel was doing in there. It's really alarming. And again, I wish more people were paying attention to your work, and that's why I have you here, so that they heard it from you and all this research that you've done. And again, Israel and these companies' response to your charges and to this clear investigation was to hide the evidence, not to address it and not to fix it in any way, but they wanted to just bury that and to hide their LinkedIn profiles now, so you can't easily search to find out, well, how many of those people are working at Meta now. And that actually leads me into where I was going next, which was Julian Assange, another canary in the coal mine. You covered Julian Assange's case early on when he was abducted in 2019 from the Ecuadorian embassy and put into Belmarsh prison in the UK. Tell me about, like, you lived near there, I'm guessing, or you somewhat close proximity. How did that feel? Like, I wasn't in independent media. You, as an independent journalist, that must have freaked you out, scared the hell out of you, first of all, that they could do this to him, they could do this to anyone. How did it affect your reporting? And now that he's out and what we've seen since, I'd love to get your assessment on what was all of that. My assessment is that they actually let him out to let an air out of a balloon, because globally there was a network of people that were tightly connected. Anytime anything happened with his case, that we could move on a moment's notice. I was part of that network. And after they let him out, it kind of let the air out of that network balloon, where everyone kind of went back to doing their own thing. And there is no real cohesive worldwide free speech movement like there was while he was locked up. So again, I know there's a lot loaded there, so I'm just going to let you go, because I'd love to hear your assessment. I haven't really heard you talk much about Assange in years, so yeah, I'd love to hear your thoughts and how this all played out, went down, and how you saw it.
Yeah, it was extremely worrying as being a journalist and an academic at the time, watching this going on. It was very chilling, and I have to admit, it did certainly, slow down my pen, if you want to use a metaphor. What I mean by that is, I did start thinking, should I be writing about this? Is it dangerous to write about? And if I'm thinking about that, working in alternative media, you better believe absolutely everybody else is looking at these signs, looking at this thinking, this is a warning to all journalists not to challenge the power of the US government, especially when it comes to leaking documents. One of the extraordinary things about the internet was it seemed to open up this huge raft of possibilities when it came to things like copying and sharing information all around the world and liberating secrecy from the shadows. You know, in the 2000s, I don't know who's listening to this, but there was this sense that, there's this incredible, brave new world out there where there were endless possibilities. And one of them was, for example, just being able to get your hands on any book or any piece of music or any film or whatever almost instantaneously and enjoying that creation immediately. But that was shut down really in the case with Aaron Swartz, who was one of the founders of Reddit. He was arrested and then charged with illegally copying and distributing or intent to distribute huge amounts of copyrighted data. And Swartz was eventually driven to suicide because of that. And likewise with Assange, there was this idea that suddenly all these government secrets would be put out into the open for everybody to see. And that terrified people in Washington and in London and in Paris and in centers of power all around the world. And so, again, there was this massive crackdown on that sort of information sharing. And Assange was really made an example of. He was treated terribly. He was forced to, live in an embassy for years where we know the CIA planned to assassinate him, uh, with at least the tacit approval of the British state there. We know, he was then, whisked out of the embassy and forced to go into a maximum security prison in the United Kingdom, held there more or less on without charge, or at least on ridiculous charges for absolutely years. They, destroyed him personally. They destroyed his reputation. They destroyed his health, mental health as well. And after only many, many years and huge amounts of people putting their lives on hold trying to get this guy free, was it finally decided that he would be allowed to leave and go to Australia. So it was, yeah, a really worrying time. It was also a live wire issue in academia as well. I mean, we had conversations among academics, and some, academics would say, well, listen, I've heard from, more senior people at academic journals that we really shouldn't, that they won't accept anything that, for example, uses WikiLeaks or Assange as a source that's considered Russian disinformation or whatever. So there was really a line drawn in the sand saying that this person and his tactics were completely beyond the pale and they must be cracked down. And one of the most serious things about the Assange case and the most chilling things about the whole thing was not so much his imprisonment, but how wall to wall, corporate media started cheering his arrest and his imprisonment. People talked about him as, this, you know, terrible Russian agent who was, a threat to national security, a traitor, etc. Never really trying to explain how an Australian living in Sweden was, a traitor to the US or the UK or whatever. But the way in which corporate media closed ranks and said Assange is not a journalist, he is not one of us, was very worrying indeed, especially because WikiLeaks was the source of so many of the greatest scoops that these corporate media outlets had in years. And in fact, Assange put a lot of these outlets on the map, and then they turned around and betrayed him and cheered his arrest and his imprisonment for years. It's very, very dangerous. And as I said, it's a warning to everyone. And it's really the end, it really marked the end of the era of this, cyberpunk utopian vision for a great internet of the future, and marked the era in which we are in now, which is a sort of dystopian hellscape of an internet that we have today.
Yeah, it's like, they It's so upsetting how they, again, nobody's ever denied anything that he ever published as the truth. That to me is just as remarkable as anything, that you've never seen anybody disprove anything that he did, yet he is still considered to be a spy or a disinformation agent or whatever you want to. The man only published things that were absolutely true and given to him by others, none of which had ever been refuted. The Iraq war logs, the Afghanistan stuff. But what really did it to them was Vault 7. And this is where, again, I think we're coming into modern times, and how he was a canary in the coal mine. They considered he and WikiLeaks to be a non-hostile state actor. Or a non-state hostile actor, sorry. That was a Pompeo designation under the Trump administration, which then allowed them to do things and treat him as a quote-unquote terrorist. We're starting to hear that now more often domestically, all right? And this was something that was predicted by a lot of the supporters and free speech advocates, to say this is where it could go, that if you accuse him of terrorism, and you are going, and I think they did not want to bring him here because they did not want to have the public trial that would have had all kinds of things questioned that people take for granted here. For example, First Amendment rights to, or Fifth Amendment right. A foreign journalist on trial, he was not, according to the papers, the court documents in the UK, that the U.S. was not necessarily going to grant him Fifth Amendment rights to not incriminate himself. And the law was clear that any person, even citizen or not, would have to abide, would get the protection of the Constitution. But all of a sudden, they decided they were going to throw all of that out. So I think that part of it was that they did not want to see that confronted and challenged at a global scale. And therefore, they had to make a decision. And I still feel like it was intimidation, that they basically told him to disappear, that they would let him out, but that he needs to go away, even though there was no quote unquote formal agreement that's ever been had. It's, as somebody who advocated so stringently for him for so long, I was hoping to at least hear something. And I don't know. Personally, I kind of feel like we've gotten little snippets here and there. The press conference in Europe, the film festival that he showed up with the T-shirt of all the Palestinian children who had been. So little things, the photos and the way that everything is staged and presented. It's frustrating for people that had actually been fighting this fight and running through the brick wall with him to kind of, look, he did all that he could do, and it's our fight now, I guess, is kind of how I see it, but it's still disappointing to see in a way. Like, there's been cameras in front of his face a few times, and he's chosen not to necessarily say everything that's on his mind. He's always been so calculated and thoughtful, and how he's always kind of spoken. How do you think that? What do you think about like how it's been since he's been out? And do you think there was a deal? Personally, speculation. I know that no, it hasn't been publicly announced or anything. I'm just asking your opinion on that.
Oh, well, if you want me to speculate wildly, then yeah, I think there probably was some sort of deal where it was like you can leave, but you got to shut up. That would certainly be my speculative answer to that. I mean, yeah, I guess I don't know what years of torture does to somebody's psyche, though. So I don't really want to guess what his mental state is, his physical state, the fact that he's got young children now that he's looking to look after. I don't know what his financial situation is like. There are so many factors that go into what he could be doing or should or shouldn't be doing right now. That's yeah, really difficult to know, seeing as we've got so little information going on this. But yeah, you're right that it's always been bigger than one person. You have to fight for civil liberties and a better future. Yeah, for sure. And that takes much more than one person.
Yeah, and so WikiLeaks was kind of dismissed in the corporate media once he was arrested. And I think, again, because similar, they don't want to say advocating terrorism or assisting people that perceived had terrorism. I think that that's kind of what's going on. You've seen this with YouTube and censorship over Hamas, and anybody that would potentially maybe think about defending Hamas as a resistance organization, even though the United Nations has all agreed that an occupied people have a right to armed resistance, that they have now been smeared and deemed as terrorists. And therefore, anybody showing any support, even though they run the entire Gaza Health Ministry and they run a lot of the services, any support or any advocacy for them now can potentially get you smeared as advocating for terrorism and see your channel demonetized or deplatformed. The artist and musician David Rovich literally just had his YouTube channel permanently deleted, and they claim it was for advocating for terrorism. It's frightening. So that all again ties back into the Julian story. But then, as far as finding independent, trustworthy sources that over time, like I've spent 5 years kind of watching independent media to try to figure out who is getting it right most of the time and telling it from the perspective of the people versus the corporations, profits, and government's perspective, which we found often screws over the people and tells blatant, direct lies in order to cover up their crimes, war crimes in a lot of cases. So kind of how do you vet sources? How do you determine whether somebody is compromised potentially or sharing information that could have potentially come from an intelligence agency because of a connection that they have? Are they an agent? Are they an asset? Are they a useful idiot? Are they countering this? It becomes such a difficult, and you talked about like the cyberpunk age that ended when Assange got locked up versus what we're in now, which is, I don't even know how to describe it. So kind of go off. Can you riff on that a little bit? Kind of, what do you think about vetting sources, figuring out who's legit and who's working with an intelligence agency? We know that in a lot of cases, in order to get funding today as a news organization, sometimes compromises have to be made. Certain topics may not be allowed to be spoken about because that upsets the funders and the benefactors. So how does all of that fit into the media landscape today, into someone like us that's actually trying to report on what's really happening out there for the people that want to know?
I mean, I guess the tactic I used and in my previous life as an academic at the Glasgow University Media Group is pretty useful here. We developed a concept in the 1970s called thematic analysis. And what that basically means is that for every even slightly contentious issue, especially in politics, there are going to be multiple explanations for what's happening, and they're going to come from a wide range of sources. And what you do basically is you go out and look for those explanations. What does this government say? What does that government say? What does these academics say? What does this media outlet say? What do these unions and organizations and NGOs say? And you start to triangulate what they're saying and what their biases might be. Again, you have to relentlessly critique your sources. Karl Marx said, question everything. And it really does come down to that. You have to look at who you're reading. What's this person's history? Where's this funding coming from? What place has printed this? What have they written in the past? Where did they get their funding? Et cetera, et cetera, et cetera. That's a lot of work, but that's the sort of work you have to do to critically scrutinize media outlets. On an individual level, when people say, what can I do to, broaden my horizons or make sure I'm not getting duped by propaganda, is start with a questioning mind to everything. Don't believe anything you say. And as I said, start triangulating uh, your sources. I think one thing that individuals can do, which is really useful, is simply start reading media from different countries, because you will be amazed at what Chinese sources or Indian sources or Latin American sources say about certain news topics that doesn't get brought up in your corporate media in Western Europe or the United States, you would be amazed how, for example, CGTN or Telesur English or RT or NDTV in India or TRT World from Turkey, they all cover things. Al Jazeera from Qatar. Have a look at how they're covering things compared to, CNN or the New York Times or the BBC or whatever, and you'll see enormous differences. And from there, you're really going to start being able to pinpoint where these people's and these organizations' biases are. That's not saying that all of the outlets that I've mentioned are good and truth tellers. I'm definitely not saying that. But what I am saying is when you're reading, say, a Chinese outlet, you're going to be able to spot their biases much easier than you are biases from news outlets in your own country. And I'd also say try to read as much as you can from alternative media, which means media that is not funded by either governments or gigantic multi-billion-dollar corporations or these NGOs, which are front groups for the corporate state or for the national security state. Unfortunately, there's vanishingly few of us left as we're getting squeezed out for all the reasons we've talked about, being deranked, demoted, delisted, and deleted from social media. But there are still are people out there doing good work, people like Consortium News or Breakthrough News or Common Dreams, Black Agenda Report. Yeah, there's loads of great sites out there if you know where to go and if you're following the right people. But I will say that if you want the truth, you're not going to be handed it on a plate. You're going to have to go out there and work for it, and that does take a lot of effort, unfortunately.
It makes me very smile when you mentioned all these outlets because every single one of them is an Indie Media Award honoree. So it looks like I've been looking in the right places, or at least we seem to think that those are among the right places. Also among the right places is where you've been publishing Mint Press News, that has hired from Robert Inlakesh to Whitney Webb to Alan McLeod, some of people that have broken some of the biggest investigative stories that have blown the lid off of corporate media for years. And their founder, Minar Mu, and that outlet is under attack constantly. Just last month, I did a story reporting about how a $51,000 Indiegogo campaign that was fundraised, crowdsourced by actual listeners, readers, and fans and subscribers was then, after it was finished, determined they don't want to hand that over to Minar to allow her to spend that money. That also, is that because is Indiegogo afraid of being accused by the U.S. government or somebody of sponsoring or supporting terrorism? Is that where, and again, I don't believe, I know for a fact that Mint Press is not an advocate for terrorism. It's a journalistic outlet that reports counterfactual stories to what the U.S. government and Israeli government would like people to hear, but they absolutely have a right to publish, right? And they should have a right to fundraise. And I think that they've had PayPal, I believe, go after their money as well. So talk about the struggles of being an independent outlet that doesn't kowtow, that doesn't take the corporate money, that challenges U.S. imperialism, and what it's like to have to operate in that kind of environment, knowing that your money is constantly being squeezed, similar to the way that Assange, by the way, was.
Listen, it is not an easy place to work in independent media, in radical media that actually challenges power and challenges the status quo. If you are going up against the biggest, most powerful forces in the entire world, and you're doing something that annoys them, they are going to fight back. And they fought back algorithmically, as we were talking about, restricting our reach by 90 something percent, whether that's on YouTube or X or wherever. We have had our account, Mintpress's account, banned and suspended on pretty much every platform, whether it's X or whether it's Instagram. We had our TikTok permanently deleted. We've had multiple funding drives dry up and stopped by these big groups. I myself had my PayPal account frozen. I think there was even money in it for supposedly suspicious activity, even though I hadn't used the account. In fact, I'd only used the account once in 12 months, and that was to buy a set of headphones from eBay for $5. And so all of these suspicious transactions that they claimed that were on my account were completely fraudulent because I hadn't received any money in there for 18 months. Um, we know that this is coming from the U.S. national security state. And in terms of me, when I had my, X account deleted, it was only brought back after a huge public backlash that led to Elon Musk himself looking into. It was actually led by some of the very worst people on Twitter, so I'm a bit embarrassed about that. But I'm glad I'm back on there. But this is par for the course in independent journalism. You're going to be crushed algorithmically. They're going to try and destroy your finances. We haven't had pretty much any advertising on our site for the longest time. I've specifically talked to people at Google about why this is, and they're saying, well, it's because, some of these comments that you've got on your comment page are a bit, a bit out there and stuff. But I just think I don't believe this when it's an article critiquing Bill Gates and his $319 million donations to corporate media. I think it's much more about that than, some comment that's been left in an article that, some comment nobody's going to read. That's the reason Google are pulling advertising from us. This goes on and on and on. And we've had our Wikipedia page defaced. It's, talks about Mint Press as if it's this awful Iranian-backed, Russian-backed, Venezuelan-backed, Turkey-backed, Palestine-backed, Iran-backed, Antifa-backed, Cuba-backed, anything that they can, stick on there to make us sound very scary and, not readable has happened to us. We've been, pretty much banned from, our links have been banned from Reddit. You can't use Mint Press as a source for Wikipedia, etc., etc. The whole point is to try to discredit and marginalize alternative media that are actually critiquing the status quo. And this latest Indiegogo thing is just an example of this. So, yeah, we had a funding drive on Indiegogo, which, by the way, we're on there because the other ones like GoFundMe have already banned us. So, that's the last one that we can do of the big crowd funding platforms that we're on. Indiegogo froze our money that people generously sent to us. Not going to lie, that is a terrible blow for Mint Press's finances. Most media companies can't really afford to lose 50K, but a tiny independent one that's just got a handful of workers on it, that's a really terrible blow. So if people do like my work and Mint Press's work and you want us to continue, you can donate to us directly by going to mintpressnews.com/donations. And we still don't know why Indiegogo did it, but I have some suspicions. One potential reason is that the CEO and co-founder is Slava Rubin, who is a super conservative Zionist who has traveled to Israel many times and says, and I'm quoting here, "I'm a big fan of Israel. I'm Jewish. I think that Israel is a beautiful place," he said, and describing Israel as on a noble fight against terrorism. So if that's what the co-founder of Indiegogo thinks, would you really want a platform of yours to be raising money to people critiquing this wonderful country that's fighting against terrorism? Maybe not. Maybe it's something completely different, but it could be anything to go with that. And that's the thing. You just never know when you're fighting the power. Honestly, when I look back at any of my articles, I think, yeah, that could have really annoyed somebody in power and led to us having the lights turned out. But that is unfortunately just something that you have to deal with when you're working in independent media, that they could come for you at any time. And so you have to be prepared for that.
Yeah. And then speaking also of that, you say that you've traveled internationally, and I see, you went to Venezuela multiple times. Have you been, and we've heard since especially 2022, journalists traveling internationally being stopped, like Kit Clarenberg, having their devices taken, being put under some kind of a restriction. Have you experienced any kind of travel hassles while you were going internationally and then having them target you for what you were saying and for your work?
Uh, Well, I certainly take precautions when traveling. So yeah, I would try not to take all my devices when traveling, try and use burner phones, burner laptops, etc. when I'm traveling. I don't intend to go to the United States. I have rejected offers to go to the US, considering what's happened to so many journalists,
Hmm.
and not even journalists, just random people whose social media has been criticizing Trump, who've been, locked in a cage for days and then finally sent back to wherever they're from after, you know, solitary confinement, what basically torturing these, poor people who just wanted to go to a conference or something. So, yeah, I'm not intending to go to the United States right now. Um, when it comes to a lot of journalists, my suspicion is that they were mostly targeted so that the authorities could get access to their phones and see who their sources were that they were basing these reports on, the sorts of people who publish leaked documents. They want to find out who the leakers were in the first place. So they're trying to make those connections. That's my assumption there. Um, but yeah, actually, a funny story. I've certainly had some hassle in Venezuela, which is again something that you might not realize if you're just concentrating or if you're just getting news from Venezuela from corporate media. You think it's this totalitarian dictatorship run by a government who can dots every I and crosses every T and controls everything. Actually, in Venezuela, there's a real Mm, not a vacuum of power, a struggle for power between the ancien regime and the new socialist government. And, when you go through customs at an airport, if the people realize that you're like a lefty journalist and they are anti-government, they might just make your life annoying and, take you out the line for 35 minutes and question you about what you've been doing in Venezuela, etc. And even when you're like, I met the president invited me for a meeting, that might be enough to actually get yourself grilled in customs because there's, as I said, there's this big battle where a lot of people in Venezuela absolutely hate the government and they'll do anything they can to try and inconvenience people who are reporting more fairly on the country. So yeah, that's probably my only story about getting stopped at customs, and it's not the one you might expect because, as I said, you might think Venezuela is this communist dictatorship where everyone bows down to President Maduro, but it's quite the opposite there. Quite the opposite.
Yeah. Again, governments are governments, leaders are leaders, and yeah, that happens in every country. I'm not terribly surprised. But as like you said, if you had gotten a Trump supporter, for example, but you were someone that they thought that said that you had met with Joe Biden, similarly, somebody in Homeland Security might be upset and give you a hard time, put you in a room as well. That's interesting, and that the only place you've really had a hard time was Venezuela. And I don't blame you for not traveling to the United States. Again, we've talked about the journalists that they've locked up. Sami Hamdi, who was famously just recently spent almost 2 weeks in solitary confinement and again tortured. And I've been reporting on this, and this again reminds me of similar shades to Assange, where they are trying to warn people and stop a certain narrative from being projected anywhere across all of their media. I think that it's why you've seen the purchases orchestrated of TikTok, and now you've seen CBS, Paramount get bought out by the Ellisons, and they continue to make moves for Discovery, Warner Brothers, and to further consolidate power over control over the media, because they realize that controlling that medium is probably now the most important thing in affecting propaganda. They understood when it came to TikTok that the 10 to 1 ratio of pro-Palestine posts to pro-Israel posts was hurting their ability to propagandize. So what did they do? Similar to the way that they yanked the LinkedIn profiles down, they just pull that stuff down and change ownership and change the algorithm, so you just won't see it anymore going forward. And most people don't, like you said, don't even realize the change was made, and that's the scariest part to me. And we've talked about several stories that people don't know about already today. But what I wanted to add, the last question I really had for you today is, what is the top story you think of that most people don't know about, but probably should?
That I've done? Maybe it's easier to answer that if it's just about my work.
Sure.
Uh, I guess what we've been talking about, which is the power of social media and how much influence it has over our minds and over what we think is possible and what is impossible, what is true and what is false, and how the United States government in particular has gone after these big social media companies and turned them into vassals of the national security state. The internet was always built from its very inception by the US military and by the US national security state for its own purposes. But these big social media companies like TikTok, like Instagram, like WhatsApp, like Facebook, like X, etc., are now all owned and operated by giant defense contractors. People like Elon Musk, who makes billions from contracts from NASA and the NSA, and people like Jeff Bezos, who's a massive CIA contractor. People don't know about this stuff. And they're putting into positions of power in these social media companies individuals whose job it is in to censor and curate the world's news feeds in a way that is conducive to the US government. So for us who are looking at news and trying to work out what's real and what's not real and are fighting for a better world, we really have to realize that we are fighting on enemy territory here. And you got to have that mentality that it's going to be taken from you at any point. And, in the long term, I think face to face organizing is really the way to go. But yeah, in the short term, we have to realize that we're very much fighting an uphill battle when we're on these media platforms. And I think we have to come up with alternatives, whatever they may be.
Yeah, it's funny because I was actually pointing out to one of my buddies that we haven't really seen a new platform pop up that took off really since TikTok. That the big corporations and the governments have really clamped down and restricted the number of platforms that have been adopted en masse. You've got little pockets of people using certain platforms elsewhere. I would guess that Substack somewhere now has started to emerge as a newer media platform that's even now been adopted by some corporate media figures as a place to publish. But that, yeah, it's a battle every day, and most of what you're seeing is not real. It's manufactured online, and I think that that's also important for people to understand. With the amount of bot activity, with the amount of paid shill activity that's happening, you're not seeing very much organically because of the algorithm manipulation, because of the way that your phones are constantly listening to what you have to say, even when the apps aren't active, so they know how to feed you content when you go back to their apps. I think that we are all put into our own little bubbles and kind of brainwashed algorithmically to an individual level so that no two people can really be on the same page about what's happening in the world. And I think that's by design. All right. Well, listen, man, I again so appreciate all your time today. I wanted to show people your links. Like I said, you are an Indie Media Award honoree, one of the first ballot Hall of Famers I saw, first class. And I put this page and this website together at Substack, indiemediaawards.substack.com. Each honoree has a page dedicated to them. I contracted with Zago Brothers to draw these illustrations for everybody. This is the page dedicated to Alan. There's also, again, a page dedicated to Mint Press because they're an outstanding outlet. So there he is on Twitter and Instagram. He also has a Telegram. It's bio at Mint Press News. And Muckrack is an aggregator of content, news content from across the web that I think is a really helpful resource sometimes. So they'll find articles and they'll scrape and find your articles and list them all in one place. So I'm a fan of that site. Like I said, Zago Brothers did the illustration. And for people to follow you on Twitter, your Twitter is at Alan R. McLeod, correct? This is the right one? And then we've got your Instagram here. And a lot of the Instagrams is sharing news, Mint Press content or tweets screen capped. And I love your Instagram, man. It's great follow. So if you're not following Alan on Instagram, for sure, you'll get tons of stuff fed to you daily that you'll be able to really understand just how much corporate media is pushing propaganda. You know, you constantly are showcasing headlines from corporate media that would embarrass them. All right, that they're proud of. It's remarkable. And here's the thing about the Indiegogo campaign and being targeted. Again, a lot of award-winning journalists coming through this place. We need to support outlets like Mint Press. We need to support journalists like Alan. And again, I can't thank you enough for your time, for your generosity, for the work that you do, and for shining a light on so many issues that we would be blind and dark to if people like you weren't there. So thank you. You know, I would love to have you back at some point. I'm sure I'm going to have more questions over time. And keep doing what you're doing. Keep fighting the fight. And to everybody out there, thank you for watching, for listening. Real quickly, to support independent media, these are the ways that we do it here. We are completely user-funded. We do not take ads. We do not take sponsorships. So it's only those people that are on that wall of fame that have contributed to our network and our channel. Those are the ways that you do it, through Cash App or Ko-fi. I don't believe in the platforms actually getting hands on our money if possible. Though if you want to subscribe through Substack, very much appreciate it. But really, support independent media. And I say this every week because we need it more than ever. I curate shows every week, and I try really hard not to use any corporate sources other than to say, here's what they're saying, and here's what the actual truth is. Because what we find is that they're spinning just constantly for their donors and owners. But Alan, really, thank you for your time today. Anything else you wanted to say before we get out of here?
No, and just to say it's good to be with you, finally speak to you, and yeah, let's talk again sometime.
All right. Well, have a great day. Thanks, everyone. We'll see you soon.
I guess this isn't such an awful place. Is that what you want?